77 years ago, history recorded one of the world's most horrendous sentencing of the youngest death row inmate in America. The case that has in many ways cast doubt on the American legal system. This is the brutal execution case of 14-year-old George Stinney. Was his case a mere abuse of fundamental human rights? What led to this terrible miscarriage of justice? Stick with me as we delve into the fate of George Stinney. In 1944, in the city of Alcolu, South Carolina, a segregated neighborhood where the whites and the blacks lived separately by a railroad. It was in this town that a young 14-year-old George Stinney had a brief discussion that would ultimately change his life and that of his family forever. George came from a humble background with the father, George Stinney Jr., who worked in the sawmill as a sharecropper, and the mother, Amy Stinney, who was a cook at the Alcolu's all-black school. He was the second among 5 siblings, and thanks to his father's work, they all lived in a 3-room apartment that was provided to them by their father's company. Though it wasn't much, but it was an honest living for the Stinney's family. But all of that will quickly turn around with the disappearance of Betty Jr and Mary Emma Thames, 2 young white sisters that lived in the same town, whom unfortunately for George were complete strangers. On one fateful day in March 1944, George and his sister, going home after grazing their family's cow, met Betty Jr, aged 11, and Mary Emma, aged 7, for the very first time. The 2 sisters were on an adventure in search of a passion flower called the maypop. They stopped to ask George and his sister where they could find the maypop flower, after which they headed off. When the 2 sisters didn't get home by sundown as expected, the police were alerted. A search party was immediately organized. Hundreds of persons, including George's father, spent nights searching. George himself offered to help by telling the police that they had seen them on their way home, telling them they said they would be going to the railroad. The police recorded George's statement in mind. The next day at sunrise, about 9 a.m., the bodies of the 2 girls were found in the muddy ditch. 7-year-old Emma had a hole boring through her skull, while 11-year-old Betty Jr had suffered blows to the head. The autopsy reported that she had received blows from a round object, leaving the back of her head with nothing but a mass of crushed bones. This made the town grow cold, as they were so shocked who on earth would want to hurt 2 little girls. Ever since the discovery of the bodies, 2 theories emerged. The first version, which actually implicated young George, was that he followed them after their meeting, striking them to death with a railroad spike. The second version was mainly heard as an unfounded rumor, saying that the sisters stopped by at the house of a prominent man in the neighborhood to ask if his good caring wife would love to accompany them on their journey. Though she wasn't able to go, her son offered to carry them in his long truck and whiskered away, never to be heard again. But the police weren't particularly interested in looking for a white killer, when of course they could use a perfect black child as a scapegoat. So the police, like always, did what they were trained to do and picked up George and his elder brother Johnny, arresting them as culpable for the gruesome murder of the 2 girls. The odds were pretty much against poor George. Not only was he surrounded by white policemen who seemed to believe he was a murderer, his family wasn't even allowed into the interrogation room or the courtroom. George's questioning was overwhelming, with officers yelling at the poor boy to admit his guilt, asking if he had tried to rape Betty and failed, hours upon hours of mentally assaulting the poor child. All George did was to endure it all by himself, without a lawyer and his family by his side, all alone. The trial was held to determine the fate of George Stinney. The charges were brought and the court session was held. His publicly provided attorney, Charles Plowden, didn't seem very interested in proving the innocence of his clients. He called no witnesses to the stand. He cross-examined nobody. He didn't even bother to check facts and evidence provided. The evidence brought to prove his guilt was utterly superficial and lacked all legal procedures. All they had on George is that he had a conversation with the girls the same day they were murdered. The presiding officer of the case, Officer H.S. Newman, along with members of the interrogation panel, said he confessed. On April 24th, 1944, after just 10 minutes of deliberation, the all-white jury found George guilty and sentenced him to death by electrocution.
That certainly is not a jury of his peers. That's certainly not a cross-section of Clarendon County at the time, which was half African-American, half white. And here we have an all-white jury with his family not being even allowed into the courtroom.
But George's suffering wasn't over yet. When the news spread that 2 white girls were killed by a black boy, this led to agitation in the white neighborhood, a clamor called to kill both the boy and his entire family. So because of this uproar, George was held in a secret location where even during the last days of his life, his family couldn't visit him. They didn't even know where he was. As George's execution day approached after that sham of a trial, things on the other side were changing for the worse. Wanting to have no relation with the convicted murderer, the company did just what every other company would do and cut their losses. They fired George Stinney Jr., taking away his family's home and their livelihood, tossing them into a world where people were ever ready to murder them in broad daylight. Young George's execution was not without riot though. Ministerial Union of all races petitioned on his behalf. Their claims range from the ethics of killing a child to Christian morality and justice of trial and conviction. There were letters and letters sent to the governor's office. Even emissaries from the Christian community visited the state house, but all those proved abortive. Protests were mounted, warning the governor, Olin Johnson, of rising racial unrest, but it was too late because so many blood-testing vampires wanted some pound of flesh. It's rumored that George's father and mother were allowed to see him one more time. Whether it's bitter or it's sweet, you decide. But what is certain is that his minister was allowed to see him and granting his last ride as a death row inmate. The day was June 16, 1944, a day George was walked to the electric chair to face his final minutes on earth. Weighing in around 95 pounds and 5 feet 11 inches tall, he was dressed in a striped jumpsuit and led to the chair in the company of the minister and his trusted Bible held close to his chest. George was about to be strapped on a chair designed for adults, but being so small, the officials had difficulties fixing the electrode around his limbs, so they took the Bible from George and used it as a booster for his seat. The execution officers asked George if he had any final words. He simply lowered his head in agony, tilted it to the right to indicate no. They pulled the strap and put it over his mouth. Then they strapped his hands and legs. George began to cry futile tears as the executioners prepared him for his death. They placed an ill-fitted adult mask over his tear-stained face. The signal was given and 2400 volts was sent through his body. His body jerked violently. The mask on his face slipped off and his wide-eyed, teary, saliva-covered face was clear for all to see. After 2 more jolts of electricity, it was over. George Stinney was dead. They had successfully killed an innocent child. In a short span of 90 days, a 14-year-old had been arrested, accused of murder, tried, convicted, executed by the state of South Carolina. George Stinney's murder conviction was re-evaluated in 2014, 70 years after his brutal execution. His siblings always believed he was innocent. After all, he did have a foolproof alibi. George had spent the entire day the girls disappeared with his sister Amy.
And I want to clear the air. We were not allowed to go any place without my mother's permission. They were very strict with us. We could not go no place, nowhere.
But unfortunately, the police were not interested in an alibi. The entire case was an obvious racist sham. So a few people went ahead to clear his name, and that they did. With the assistance of George Francis, Steve Mackenzie, Matt Burgess, and Ray Brown, a motion for a new trial was filed in October 25, 2013. It was brought to light that the culprit had already been named for the murder after a deathbed confession. The person was rumored to be a white male from a wealthy family who was at 2013 already dead. Not only that, to add salt to injury, the culprit was also part of the jury for George's sham trial. Actual proper evidence was given in the court hearing in January 2014. Testimonies came from both his siblings and known relative witness, George's former cellmate Wilford Hunter. He stated that George never wrote the confession, that he was told by George that he had been made to confess, although he was innocent. George's confession was rendered null and void. After all, this so-called evidence was an unrecorded, unsigned confession by a 14-year-old boy who was deprived of legal counsel and parental guidance. Judge Colin Mills in December 2014 vacated George's conviction on the grounds that he didn't receive a fair trial and his Sixth Amendment rights were violated. She ruled that, in line with the Constitution ban on cruel and unusual punishment, the execution of a 14-year-old boy in less than 90 days constituted a cruel and unusual punishment. George's siblings were understandably overjoyed to be able to live and witness their brother's name being exonerated after 70 years. Though this comes as a cold comfort for the grave injustice they suffered, as George's brother Charles puts it.
He already paid for his life, and nothing would, even if they take it off, it would still not bring him back.
And so that was the fate of George Stinney. He lived a short life. He was accused of a crime he never committed and died surrounded by strangers, only for his name to be exonerated after 70 years. A true American tragedy. If you want to watch something less tragic, click on the screen to watch a man who sliced his tongue, nose, ear and fingers just to look like an alien. While at it, please do not forget to click on the thumbs up button. Subscribe for more content of this sort. Like always, I love you guys and I will see you in the next one. Bye.